for being here today. The trigger warnings for today's talk, which is entitled The Lack of Intersectionality, a Moral Inconsistency of the Animal Rights Movement. It's going to be speciesism, sexual assault, violence, sexism, racism, heterosexism, and ableism. So a lot of trigger warnings so people can be advised of. Before we start this talk, how many people in this room think that supporting animal liberation detract from animal liberation struggles? That talking about multiple things at the same time detract from the message or can get the message diluted?
I can't say one way or the other, but I can say that there can be a discussion on both sides of that.
And doesn't it maybe necessarily not animal rights? Let's say, who thinks that talking about racism and heterosexism at the same time detracts from the cause of LGBTQ struggles? Nobody? That's great. So I don't even have to convince anyone.
Do you mean for us personally or in general?
Both.
Because I see in a general attitude in other people, I do see where it can be detracting, because I know people personally that don't want to hear more than one message. I know people personally that
but if you think of the bigger
I
picture.
don't care about that, I just care about this.
But thinking of the bigger picture, would you sacrifice that for one person, or how do you feel about that? You know, because you're saying, this one person is going to be bothered.
I mean, I'm not saying one person, I'm saying that could be an issue affecting. I'm sure there are other people that fall into that.
That's true. That's very true. But okay, so I guess the vast majority agrees that it is possible to talk about multiple issues at the same time without diluting our message.
It's one system. It's just fighting the system that supports all these different injustices. Yeah.
Very good. Cool. So this is our picture of disruption we did during Nathan's hot dog eating contest. And for folks who don't know about Nathan's, it is a ESPN televised contest, and it has been around since 1916, so it's pretty old. And in recent years has attracted more than 40,000 fans to come in person for that event, and it's obviously televised, so nationwide, and also a lot of international fans. So what we did is we threw two activists on stage, and then we disrupted it, and one of the competitors on the side that you can see here said something like, "Animals, go fight for humans instead," meaning that we couldn't possibly be fighting also for human rights, or that we don't care about those issues. Has anyone ever heard similar things before? Yes. Some examples? Would you like to?
Kaporos. You know, like, why are you doing this? You know, there's. Well, I heard of Kaporos is in Syria. What's going on in Syria? ISIS used to be fighting that. You know?
Yeah, so it's way more common than we think, and it happens a lot of times. So animal rights activists are often accused of not caring about humans, and we can argue that usually these accusations come from people who have just had their speciesism challenged and who feel attacked. So that's kind of more of a reactionary response to it. But we can also obviously argue that we do indeed care about other humans, right? But this happens so often that even people who have never been faced with their speciesism have come to believe that animal rights activists simply do not see humans as important as animals. And here's some examples of why people may see our movement as a misanthropic movement. So let's start with the picture on the left side. There's an example of racism and misanthropy, and the context is the dog trade in China. And the person says, "I would love to be there. I would put bombs to kill all these sick people." So this was probably someone I had on my Facebook who's an animal rights activist and a vegan. The next picture is of Kendall Jones. For those of you who are not familiar with who she is, she's a hunter who's heavily targeted by animal rights activists, and vegan who is a woman, okay, photoshopped her shirt and substituted the word hunt with cunt, which is, as we know, a pretty sexist term to reduce women to basically their private parts. So that's an example of sexism and misanthropy. And on the final picture, I read statistics show that animals abuser commit less abuse after they've been shot. So pretty heavy, classic misanthropic remark, and all coming from animal rights activists who are vegan. So I wrote an article actually not long ago which spoke about breaking the hero worship, where I share my personal stories and talk about how we should avoid putting people in pedestals, specifically activists. So to do the same thing here, I'd like to share a few screenshots of my personal Facebook page back in 2013. So I went vegan on April 2013, so not that long ago actually, and the world for me was very dark, darker than it had ever been actually. I was never a fan of people in general to begin with. I've identified myself better with animals, but I got very angry after I went vegan and found out, the atrocities that are caused to animals. So here are a few things I said. So in the first example, I said, now I hope this piece of garbage, Venus Laventer, starves in prison, when talking about a woman who almost killed her dog by starving him. So the next picture is me talking about Michael Vick, and I said, I hope he dies slowly. So I put racism and misanthropy there for a few reasons, even though I'm not directly saying anything specific to his race. The implications of a white woman wishing death upon a black man in the United States is pretty heavy, because the United States is a country who's pretty racist. So for me to come off that way, I just have to be aware of my implications when saying those things publicly. So has anyone here ever behaved in a similar fashion? A few people. That's acceptable at some point. Yeah. This is why we're having this discussion, right? Because I think while feelings of sadness and anger regarding the human species as a whole, or certain individuals in particular, like I did here, in relation to animal exploitation may be very understandable, right? We really need to be aware of it, and we need to carefully watch ourselves when we start moving into a misanthropic direction. And first, because, a misanthropic attitude, like anything that is negative, hurts us. It consumes us. But most importantly, in terms of our animal advocacy, it hurts animals and it affects our activism. And I will discuss the reasons why.
But I have a question.
Yes.
If your intent and motivation, if there was no racism in your heart when you posted that, it's like if not, you were saying, here's a black man who did this terrible thing.
Uh-huh.
I mean, you're putting that up because you're conscious of what people are going to think, that you're going to be labeled. I don't know. I don't know why there's such a rush to, assume that whenever somebody says something about a certain ethnicity or color of the skin, that the intent of the person is like, what do they call it, the word, playing the race card kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
would you like
because
to?
you're white doesn't mean that you have malice.
Oh, absolutely.
In your heart.
Sure,
you know what I mean?
absolutely
And
not.
I don't think people should jump to that so quickly either.
Sure, but you wanted to add something to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. People shouldn't, but people do, and they will. And I think that I too get just so angry with things like this. I mean, the kind of anger I never felt in my life about anything or anyone else when I see things like this. So I do understand, but I think what she's saying is that the way I see it is posting something like that, even though it's what you're feeling, it kind of detracts from your goal, from the message that you're trying to send, because people, instead of when they're scrolling down, they see just anger.
Right.
And then they're going to keep on scrolling.
Right.
As opposed to coming about it in a way where it's going to inform people without offending them.
But yeah, we can talk more about this. So basically, how do we think we can change this view of, you know, activists being portrayed that way? I think there are definitely those among us who truly believe that we cannot fight one system of oppression, in this case speciesism, can be racism, heterosexism, whatever, by supporting another system of oppression, racism, sexism, heterosexism, etc., etc. So in this case, you know, I have a picture of hens and then feminists. So a lot of feminists, you know, don't consider animals who are female to be worthy of moral consideration. So in our view, it is morally inconsistent to claim that we care about the bodily autonomy, say, of hens in that case, but to oppose the bodily autonomy of women, just as it is morally inconsistent to say that we care about equality but exclude certain species who are worthy of that consideration, in the case of feminists not considering other animals worthy of their consideration. So according to Javid Deck, he says, for animal rights to be a movement that actually transforms relationships between humans and animals, it needs to take seriously issues of race, class, and gender, and the way these impact animal systems. So just like the transformation feminist and queer struggles have undergone as they cross cultural boundaries, so must animal struggle change across these boundaries, which I think is, I just love how he phrased this. So in the 70s, black feminists who worked both for women's rights and civil rights started looking at gender and race as connected issues. So what was going on in that time is that feminists weren't really addressing questions of race, and the civil rights movement was not addressing questions of gender. So they developed a theory and practice called intersectionality, which is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. So applying Crenshaw's framework of intersection to other systemic oppressions, we can no longer see discrimination based on gender, race, I'm going to add species because we're animal rights activists, class, ability, sexual orientation, etc., as just separate and independent from one another, because these axes of identity interact on multiple levels and they contribute to systemic injustice and social inequality. So oppressive systems also share the same roots, right? They not only have the same strategies, the same tactics, but they also share patterns of behavior and also thought. So in her essay, Crenshaw uses this analogy of a traffic and an intersection, a crossroad, to concretize the concept. She says, and I quote, "Consider an analogy to traffic in an intersection coming and going in all four directions. So discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any numbers of directions and sometimes from all of them." So why is this concept so important? For many reasons, but one that I would like to point out and start going deeper into our talk is that by rejecting the idea that oppressions are independent from one another and embracing the concept that systems of oppression are connected, we avoid ranking or establishing hierarchies of oppression. So what does that mean in practice? We avoid saying things like sexism matters more than racism, or racism is more important than ableism. Speciesism is the worst form of discrimination that there is out there. This practice of ranking is wrong in many levels, but primarily it overlooks the fact that all forms of oppression are harmful and they are unjust. This does not mean, obviously, that as activists we should attempt to dismantle all forms of oppression, because that is just simply pretty unrealistic. It's perfectly fine and most effective, actually, to have a focus, in this case, animal rights for us. But it's also crucial that we remain supportive and inclusive of other social justice causes, because it's the right thing to do, and because movements can only benefit from building bridges between one another. So why should we care about other struggles? Because it's the right thing to do. That's pretty simple, right? There's nothing wrong with choosing just to be morally consistent. Let's care about multiple things at the same time. It's totally okay. 2, if we want animal liberation, then we really have to build bridges. According to Professor Will Kilmincock, which is a very well-known professor internationally, he says that 99% of the intersectional analysis that is done by the left today completely ignores the intersection of species. So, repeating that, 99% of all intersectional analysis completely ignores animal rights. They do not talk about animal rights. Animal rights does not matter. So he adds, I think there is no way for the animal rights movement to possibly succeed without the support from other social justice movements. It's kind of simple. Our movement consists of humans, right? And our goal won't be achieved if we don't convince other people to join us. Unfortunately, this is the first movement where the victims can't just rebel or form groups where they can strategize how to get out of this oppression. So it's constituted by humans. So we need to convince other humans, basically. And 3, being able to create a safe space for activists and potential supporters is key to grow our movement. Because if we choose to ignore the intersections of oppression, we run a great risk of turning people away from our cause. So what does that mean? Create a safer space. Basically, we drafted out the safer space agreement. It just basically goes through some points saying if you want to be part of this community, there will be some sort of behaviors that will not be tolerated, like racist behaviors, homophobic behaviors, blah, 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 blah. And then it go into each of them. And then people basically sign it and say, okay, I will commit myself, even if I'm really, really angry, that at a protest, I will not call, like you said, the caporos, who are done mostly by Orthodox Jews. I will not say that Jew is a monster when I am protesting, because it's going to come off racist, coming off from a white person, and it's just not okay, So people basically commit themselves to trying to manage that situation, and they get to learn a lot about other social justice issues as well. I think it's a good start. So it seems like the word intersectionality currently get a lot of attention, but it gets a lot of confusion as well. So quite often what happens is there isn't a mention of the originators of the concept, which leaves it to be kind of like a white-centric circle, sort of like how Stonewall riots are perceived to be started by white, cisgender, gay male, which in truth was not, was organized by transgender folks. So the same thing happens with intersectionality. People don't know that it started with black feminists. So I just pulled up a quote of a website which empowers black women and does art, media, social media, and all that, and just basically talks about how it has sort of become this buzzword, but when feminists talk about it, white feminists talk about it, they don't put it into practice, and 2, they never talk about who originated the concept. So I think the right thing to do, obviously, is always say who originated the concept. And there were some debates, I think, on our Facebook event about if the word intersectionality should be even used at all for this talk, because, I am not a black feminist, I'm a white feminist. And to that answer, we can talk a little bit more maybe towards the Q&A, but just as a quick thing, I think from my research and what I understood is that black folks get really pissed if you don't mention where it came from. Basically, you just treat it as something that white feminists invented. So I kept the word intersectionality there because, 1, I'm talking a lot about the origins of the subject, and in other materials of our group, we usually say like pro-intersectional or things like that to kind of like avoid people saying you're being appropriative, even though people who always say that are like white male. So moving forward with that. So we would like to share our view about how we are learning to apply this concept to our group. And when we first basically started Collectively Free, our dream was to create an anti-speciesist group that embraced intersections of oppression, both internally and in our community, externally in our actions. So remember this here, when they're saying just throw the word around, but you don't really put it into action. So we're trying to do our best to put it into actions. First step is definitely checking our privileges. It's very important. So this is an ongoing process. It's very hard to make. But let's do a little exercise here just so we understand what checking our privileges is. And this is not meant to like point fingers on anybody and say like, you're more privileged than me, you know, it's not about that. It's actually the results can be pretty surprising, and it's just good to put things into perspective for ourselves. So you're gonna raise your hand, okay, if you think that the privilege I'm gonna say applies to you, okay? So I have access to clean water. Everybody in this room, pretty much, right? Okay. That is a privilege. You have where to sleep. You don't have to worry about being killed for food or clothing. Yeah. That's just 3. We can go on forever about this, right? So if we think about the amount of things that we do have that we take for granted, that can be pretty good. And if we got even deeper, we will see some people not raising their hand and some others. So it's a cool game, put things into perspective. Obviously, being humble. So when you have offended someone from a particular group, you have to listen to them and not disregard their pain with like buts. You know, the intention may be good, but the context is hurtful. So for example, if you're male, right, and something you have said made me uncomfortable and I feel like that was sexist, please don't stay like, but I meant to blah blah blah, because that's just hurtful, you know. So the best thing to do to de-escalate a situation like this, just be like, wow, okay, I understand, you know, I'm sorry I hurt your feelings, we can continue this conversation another time. Just things can get a little out of control when there are a lot of like, I didn't mean to. You know, if you're in a position of power versus someone who felt hurt, just listen to them. Establishing and applying our safer space agreement, which I talked about. Anyone who's interested in seeing it, I'm more than happy to share with any of you. We also have meetings that address intersectionality, like today's meeting. That's very important to share this knowledge with other activists and have a discussion about it. Empowering activists to have a strong voice, to be outspoken and know they're being heard, especially people that are parts of minorities. You know, so folks who obviously LGBTQ community, people of color, women, we always want to try to empower that minority to speak up and take the lead. And if you think about, you know, like the animal rights movement is mostly consisted by women, and it's also mostly led by men. So here's another example of, you know, hardcore patriarchy, sexism playing into our own movement. You know, it's mostly women that care about veganism and care about animal rights, and yet the very few that are in a position of leadership. So checking that our message is respectful to other groups. So example that when we're doing speak outs, that we're not using racist, ableist, homophobic, or ageist language. Obviously can be a very fine line sometimes, and obviously there's a lot of like, you're gonna compromise the message to not offend someone. It's like it's not much of that. It's more like, how can we work around that message to cause the same impact without having the need to be racist, you know? So for example, in our upcoming action, which is called Glass Walls, Who Do We See? Which, by the way, it's gonna happen at 4:00. So if you want to come to an action after, you want to stick around for action, it's happening. We're going to do an action at Starbucks. Can give you more details about it. But basically, we had this idea of having activists wear folds on their eyes and other activists across from them holding iPads with footage about what happens behind Starbucks walls. So the whole point was that we didn't want it to seem like ableist or that was hurting people that don't have the ability to see. So I reached out to a few folks. There's a very awesome group called Visibility Disability on Facebook. I always confuse it. Disability, visibility, visibility, visibility. So I posted there our message and said, hey, we have this idea, is it... First I reached out individually, and the person told me, no, they didn't think it was, but she's not a representative of the entire community, so I should just post it on the group. So I said, hey, is this offensive? So the response was like, no, it's okay, as long as we make it very clear to other activists and organizers not to use words such as blindfold or say turn a blind eye to, because it implies that people that can't see have some sort of like disadvantage to people who can't see, and we don't want to like put those people down basically. But I'm gonna show real quick what it looked like, just so you can have an idea, because our chapter in North Carolina did it today.
We're here today to ask a simple question. If Starbucks had glass walls, what would we see? If what we found appalled us on a deep moral level, could we continue to shield ourselves from the truth? Now you can see what Starbucks wants to keep hidden. The milk and cream in this coffee was taken from cows who were mechanically forced into pregnancy, only to have their calves stolen from them, with the females trapped in the same existence.
And things like that is just very good to always, because sometimes you think you're not being offensive, and then you might be, and so it's good to check. Message that reflect common goals. In this case, if we're trying to tackle, obviously, speciesism and racism, so message that can reflect that continuity between the two things also are very implemented in our actions. And not being afraid of making mistakes. Our goal is growth, not purity. So analyzing our movement and beyond, there are some failed attempts to intersectionality that really stand out. So the point here, I would like to try and discuss some of these examples here. Obviously, the point is not to say that this is wrong and again point fingers, but just critically examine the messaging behind them. In our view, the more inclusive we can be, the more effective our messaging will be. So we can get the same result, right? And let me emphasize, if we can get the same result with a messaging that is both, say, anti-speciesist, but also respects and includes other forms of oppression, why would we want to take this shortcut? So we too obviously have made plenty mistakes on our journey, but we have also tried our hardest to remain humble and recognize our mistakes. So this is one of our posters that we used to have. The story behind this is a story of an activist called Heather, who's not here today, but she's a hardcore activist. And she felt very triggered during one of our protests after hearing an activist casually throwing around the word rape, as if it was just a trivial word. She was like crying, and she didn't want to talk to anybody, so she just went away. So we reached out to her and we heard her concerns and asked her to actually do a panel discussion that she entitled "The Importance of Language in Our Movement." And we learned from Heather that we obviously learned a lot from Heather that day, and it pushed us forward to officially retire the poster. We hadn't used it in a long time, but the decision wasn't because of personal purity, like we said, or because she or us, or both of us and Heather, don't believe that cows are raped. It's not that we don't believe. It is true. Cows are forcefully impregnated in order to obtain milk. But she taught us that we can actually obtain the same results when we're talking about dairy without having to say that cows are raped. And she's survival of sexual assault. So she did a speak out at Whole Foods about that. She spoke on behalf of cows, and it was one of the most powerful speak outs I've ever heard in my life. For real, I'm not exaggerating. And she did not mention once the word rape. She talked about how she had felt like someone took her bodily autonomy away from her and stripped, her body away from her, and then she made this analogy with the cow, and it was just like perfect. And she achieved a much more powerful result than I think any of us would have had if we had just casually thrown around the word. So just things to learn. The next one. The context of this one was found in a vegan blog. So can anyone tell me what they think about this particular ad? Or if there's anything that jumps out at you? You have something?
Yeah, I mean, I think with all of these things, we can always say, I can see why they made that
Right.
choice.
Exactly.
It's not about that. And the whole point is, I think, like in this particular case, we'd say, yeah, I can see why we feel the need to appeal to traditional ideas of masculinity. But the whole point, I think, is what we're trying to raise here is, well, it's harmful, and it might be so harmful that to play into that traditional notion that we ought to just abandon it altogether and not try to pander to these, sexist or patriarchal ideas. But I mean, I'm with you that, to me at least, some of these, I still tell people that you can still be big and strong if you want to, if that's what you're into.
Yeah.
And I might, even capitalize on showing some big, buff, sexy dude to do it. But I think I think it's fair to have mixed feelings about it, because a big part of me wants to say, well, like, who cares? That's not what it means to be a man.
Right. Very good points. Yeah. So this next one, just for I guess a little bit of context. It's PETA. Folks are obviously dressed up as member of the KKK. And well, I guess I can't really give much context without saying what it is. Well, this is basically PETA thought it was a good idea to dress up as members of KKK to target breedists, so people that breed dogs, comparing them, basically saying that breeders are obsessed with the pure race, the same way that KKK members believed in the superiority of the white race. So there they were outside the streets, just hanging out with their KKK outfits and doing some outreach. Anything wrong with this?
Oh God. Where to start?
There's truth to it, but is it effective? No.
No, that was a huge backlash.
That's the point.
Yeah.
You really have to just be pragmatic.
Huge backlash on this, obviously.
Yeah.
The Afro-American community was completely outraged at PETA, and obviously just, throw all the animal rights activists and groups into the same pot and saying how animal rights activists don't care about human issues. Yeah. This next one is at a so-called slut walk in the UK. And this to me doesn't even make much sense, but is it legal to eat me if I wear bacon? Well, I don't know. It's just so speciesist and just weird.
The oral sex is
Just kind of weird. What's missing in this message, basically, right?
Well, there's definitely objectification of women
Yes.
thrown in there too.
Absolutely.
Just a good example of how patriarchy is really oppressive to men and women. And it's a good case where the woman is being sexualized as a sex object, and it also says, men, if you can't get an erection, then you're we don't want you, and you're not a real man.
Right. And the last one is from Black Lives Matter, which obviously it's a group community that I really love and appreciate so much. But anything wrong with this particular case? It's a Black Lives Matter sort of celebration, so they're roasting an entire pig with a police officer's hat, basically saying that cops are pigs, and here we are feasting on them, we win, this is our power over, this individual, and obviously very speciesist, unfortunately. So when it comes to races or religious and cultures that we're not part of, we have to be really careful in how we craft our message and our attitude towards them. So how can we justify aggression and violence to a specific group but seek dialogue and provocation with another group, so the one on the bottom? In one hand, we categorize the other as monstrous, and those who are more familiar to us just as unaware. But the truth is that both sceneries here, they're both speciesists. So let's start with the picture on the left, up top. It's a picture of a practicing Orthodox Jew at Kaporos. and it's a ritual that involves the sacrifice of chickens, and the ritual is practiced on public sidewalks, and obviously is a terrible thing to witness. Still is that for me, and I hope that people can see that, is that Jew is different, definitely not different than the customers that are buying the piece of meat, they're ordering the Starbucks latte with their milk, and the family dinner who's eating a whole turkey. So the second image is of Eid, which is the second largest Muslim celebration, also involves the torture and death of animals. And when those two holidays or celebrations come up on my newsfeed, is tons of racist things. And also with the third picture, which is the drug trade in China. And obviously this images horrify people, and usually horrify a lot of people who are also eating bodies of animals as they are horrified, because it's always easier to point the finger at the other culture you're not part of and say how savages these Chinese people are, while you're there eating your hamburger and etc., etc. But also internally for activists, it's something I would like to ask everybody, if you're at any of these protests, that you're very aware of the fact that you're an outsider, you're not part of this culture. You really have to be careful in how you put yourselves out there, and don't think that these people are more monstrous than any of the people on the bottom buying and being consumers, because they're not any different. So as far as our external commitments, obviously we apply the Safer Space Agreement. We are active allies to other groups, and by other groups I mean not only other animal rights groups, but other social justice issues. So even if Black Lives Matter is a speciesist, I like to support them and hopefully find a way of having this open dialogue with them about their speciesist attitude sometimes. But they are a group that I like to support a lot. We can also do active volunteer for intersectional causes like Food Not Bombs, which is an amazing organization that feeds anyone that needs a vegan meal. They don't discriminate. Also, the Food Empowerment Project is a great group to be part of, and if you can do any volunteer work for them. And obviously pro-intersectional actions, so we also trying to apply that concept to our actions, and we definitely carefully craft these actions and always try to maximize our efforts and our efficacy to the message, check in with other groups like we spoke about it before. So in terms of delivering effective message for our activism and building bridges, I guess our first big effort was the NYC Pride Parade. We wrote a speak out and chants that reflected the common goals of anti-speciesist and anti-heterosexist messages, and it was very, very well received. The feedback from our video was overwhelmingly positive, both from the LGBTQ community and the animal rights community. So that was very good. But there's some new folks in here that would like to share this video with you. So if you don't mind.
We are marching here today to celebrate love. So when I think about love, I think about my wife, I think about my family, I think about my friends from all creeds and cultures and race and ages and sexual orientation and gender identity. I think about all my brothers and sisters whose struggles we are allies with, who are never met.
That was our march. Yay. Thank you. Something like sensitive to the community, and it was also coming from someone who is part of the community, right? It wasn't a cisgender heterosexual male talking about it, so that's also very important. And this is why it was pretty well received. Also, it wasn't, I guess, until we launched our Starbucks campaign that we had the opportunity to really bring the concept into our actions, because the Gay Pride Parade was more of an event, right? So now we launched an international campaign against Starbucks, and also it is a pro-intersectional campaign. Definitely, I think on our first action, I have never felt so listened to in an action we participated, and I am 100% sure it is because we also talked about human rights issues. So on this campaign, this is one of our posters for this campaign, more on the happy side. Let's pretty well received. But the way we constructed this campaign is we started with the screening of a documentary called Black Gold, which was an expose of how coffee workers are treated in Ethiopia, and Starbucks plays a big part of oppressing and exploiting those coffee workers. So we went to Starbucks and we invited workers to come and watch, and I think 2 or 3 of them came. We weren't very good at making them feel comfortable. It was kind of like an awkward situation for them because, like, here they were, maybe in this room, I think, or in some other room, you know, surrounded by animal rights activists, watching a documentary about how their company sucks. So it must have been really weird for them, and they kind of like left right after the thing was done and didn't stay for the Q&A. So it was kind of like our fault for not making them feel more invited and, you know, presenting the issue maybe in a different way. So we hope we can do better next time, but I think the idea stands. That's how we would build the campaign. So talking about also the exploitation of coffee workers and carefully analyzing the continuity between how animals are exploited too in the system of oppression. So that's the documentary, which I highly recommend for anyone to watch. It's really good and really sad. Besides that, we did a Chick-fil-A action that gained massive media attention, including a little blurb on the New York Times. That brought both the animal rights issue and the heterosexist, homophobic issue that Chick-fil-A has. So for you, if any of you know, Chick-fil-A is publicly a homophobic company, and they fund groups that are anti-gay. So we staged a kiss-in into their store. So me and my partner kissed at the store, and then we delivered Speak Out for Animal Rights, and then we were escorted out, and it was a lot of fun. And then we did this little meme that got a lot of attention too, so it's pretty cool. So obviously our community is not perfect, and we'll surely continue to make mistakes and learn from them, but, you know, don't worry. Our community will still be very hardcore and progressive, even if we are now with the little bonus. That means that we care about multiple things at the same time, because I think the big fear of activists is saying, like, if I care about other things, I'm like putting the animals last, you know, like I can't care about 2 things at the same time. The animals come first, you know, I'm not going to be as hardcore. Like, don't worry, you're still going to be pretty hardcore, but you know what's going to happen now is that our activism will no longer appear as a one-way street, but as a lane on a highway, and a highway that share with other forms of liberation and equality and freedom. So if you don't know about what we do or what Collectively Free does, this is again a really short video.
I got a simple question for you. Here's the question. Do you believe that one day you're not going to live in a world that was given to you? That's right, but you are going to actually live in the world that you dream of.
One struggle, one fight!
Human freedom, animal rights!
The idea that it's a turkey's job to be your food, to me this is just as offensive as saying that it's a woman's job to have children and be in the kitchen.
That's some of the things we do, as most of you know. Non-violent forms of direct action. So we'll go into an establishment that is exploiting animals, and we'll try to change the norms and the culture of speciesism by delivering a speak out. So it's proven to be pretty effective on other social justice movements, such as the Indian independence movement, the civil rights movement. So we take it from there, from other experiences throughout histories. So obviously, beyond veganism, there is activism for us. And you know, we can think of like how wonderful would it be, right, if all that we needed to do to abolish the wrongs in the world was not to commit those wrongs ourselves in the first place. So for example, if we want to end racism, all we need to do is don't be racist. Or if we want to end sexism, all we needed to do was not to engage in sexist activities. If we want to end, you know, homophobia, then don't be homophobic. But we know that in order to really make social changes, we need more than non-participate in them. We need to actively work with groups, and even can be sometimes even yourself, that work towards eradicating them. So groups and communities that work toward anti-racism or anti-sexism, and in our case, anti-speciesist messages. So our mission is simple. Obviously, it's total animal liberation by challenging the dominant culture of speciesism and raising consciousness on a mass scale through highly creative, nonviolent campaigns and using anti-speciesist messages. So we tell the animal stories, we build a community, and emphasize pro-intersectionality, underscoring the connection between all kinds of oppressions, human and unhuman, while maintaining the focus on the animals. Can be very tricky and challenging sometimes, but I think we're doing pretty well with that. And here's just a few examples of what we do. Like I said, direct action. We do theatrical demonstrations, so you might have seen in the movie. There's a campaign we have called Swap Speciesism, where we think what would be the scenario if humans were being farmed instead of animals being farmed. So it's kind of like a funny skit. It's kind of comical and not so much on the realistic side, and it's inviting to people, and people always think it's like, the reactions we get is like, this is sick, you know, like, yeah, it is sick, right? It's like, it's horrible. And that's kind of what we did. That's what we do to animals, you know. So it's fun to do it, and I think it's effective. I don't know. I don't have any studies or data to share with anybody on that. But I always think that theater and, you know, art is a very powerful tool to activists. And then we have projections towards compassion, which is projector that we do, and we put this footage of animals, animal cruelty, and, you know, farming, animal agriculture, et cetera, on the walls of New York City. It's getting really cold, so we're probably not going to do that for a while anymore. But we're doing it on subways now, so it's pretty simple. You can get your iPad or your laptop, and you can literally just sit on a very warm subway ride and just stay there with your thing, and a lot of people watch. We do it with masks, so it kind of makes you a little invisible and doesn't make people so uncomfortable because you're not like staring directly to them. So it's nice to have that invisibility or erasing of your own identity aspect of it. So we will be doing more of those. We'd love to have more people to come and join us for that too. Open meetings like this one, panel discussions, participation in other groups, like I mentioned. Done some screenings. Educational programs are not very like high on that. It's not our forte, but we have done some of those things. It's just not something we focus a lot on. And to conclude, what is the conclusion to all this? But you know, like I think what I hope from this is, one, you know, like we're always learning. I'm always learning. You know, I posted. You've seen my Facebook screenshots. You know, I've done a lot of mistakes, and I think I still do a lot of mistakes. But for me, it's so important that we remain open to this idea that, yes, it is possible to care about multiple things at the same time. And in fact, it's going to help our movements succeed better if we do so. You know, like keep that 99% statistic that I told about the left intersectionality that don't mention animal rights, any other social justice movements cares or mentions about animal rights. So we really have to do some hard work so that they do, you know. And how are we going to do it if we don't support their cause? We have to truly care. That's number one, like I said, because you have to care. Because if you have a hidden agenda, then forget about it, you know. It's kind of like not genuine and just not good enough, but just care. It's important. And yeah, I'm sorry, it's almost 4 o'clock. We have to run to the park because we're going to have an action at Starbucks. Thank you so much for being here today.